Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the gaslit nightmare of Victorian London, where the fog rolls thick as molasses through narrow cobblestone streets, and somewhere in that choking darkness, history's most infamous serial killer is sharpening his blade. You can almost smell the coal smoke mixing with human waste, hear the clip-clop of horse hooves echoing off grimy brick walls, and feel that creeping sensation that someone, or something, is watching from the shadows. The year is 1888, and you're about to discover why you absolutely, positively wouldn't survive a single day under the reign of terror that was Jack the Ripper. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing our little global community come together for these midnight history sessions. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888, and already your modern sensibilities are under assault. The stench hits you first. A cocktail of unwashed bodies, rotting food, horse manure, and the acrid bite of industrial smoke that seems to coat everything in a thin layer of grime. This isn't the romanticized Victorian London of period dramas with their pristine drawing rooms and elegant carriages. This is the underbelly, where nearly 1 million people are crammed into conditions that would make a modern refugee camp look luxurious. You're wearing the rough wool clothing of the working class because, let's face it, that's what you'd be in this era. The fabric scratches against your skin, already damp with sweat and soot. Your boots, if you're lucky enough to have them, leak at the seams, and you can feel the cold October dampness seeping through to your feet. The gas lamps flicker weakly in the perpetual twilight created by London's infamous fog, casting dancing shadows that seem to move with malevolent purpose. The streets themselves are a death trap. Cobblestones slick with a mixture of rain, mud, and things you don't want to identify create treacherous footing. Open sewers run alongside the walkways, carrying disease and creating breeding grounds for rats the size of small cats. Historians still argue whether the sanitation improvements of the 1860s had actually reached the East End by 1888. But one thing's certain, you're breathing air thick enough to chew, laden with particles that would have your modern lungs screaming for mercy within minutes. But here's the thing that would really get you, the noise. Victorian London wasn't quiet. The constant clatter of iron-shod wheels on stone, the shouts of street vendors, the crying of babies in overcrowded tenements, and the general din of humanity packed too tightly together creates a sensory overload that never stops. Even at night, when most people huddle behind their thin walls, you can hear the sounds of survival, coughing, arguing, the occasional scream that might be domestic violence or might be something worse. You quickly realize that privacy is a luxury you simply don't have. Families of 8 or 10 people share single rooms, and the walls are so thin you know intimate details about your neighbors' lives whether you want to or not. The concept of personal space doesn't exist when you're paying by the bed in a doss house, sharing sleeping quarters with strangers who might rob you, assault you, or simply cough tuberculosis directly into your face. And speaking of disease, you're walking into what amounts to a biological warfare zone. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, and tuberculosis run rampant through the overcrowded slums. The infant mortality rate hovers around 50%, and life expectancy for the working class barely reaches 40. You don't have antibiotics, vaccines, or even a basic understanding of germ theory. A simple cut could kill you through infection, and that persistent cough you've developed from the polluted air might be the first sign of consumption slowly eating away at your lungs. The social hierarchy is rigid and unforgiving. If you're a woman, you have virtually no rights and few options for legitimate employment. If you're poor, and you're considered morally deficient by the middle and upper classes, who genuinely believe that poverty is a character flaw rather than a systemic problem. The police view you with suspicion at best and outright hostility at worst, seeing the residents of Whitechapel as a criminal class to be controlled rather than citizens to be protected. The autumn of 1888 transforms your already precarious existence into something approaching a waking nightmare. You notice the change gradually at first. Conversations that stop when you approach, nervous glances cast toward darkened doorways, the way people hurry their steps as evening approaches. The usual dangers of Whitechapel, the pickpockets, the violent drunks, the territorial gangs, suddenly seem quaint compared to something new stalking the streets. You're living in what historians now recognize as the perfect hunting ground for a serial killer, though that term won't be coined for another century. The narrow, twisting streets of the East End create a maze where someone could easily disappear into the shadows, and the transient population means that missing persons often go unreported for days or weeks. The local residents have learned not to trust authority, not to ask too many questions, and certainly not to venture out alone after dark unless absolutely necessary. But here's your first major problem. You don't have the luxury of staying indoors when the sun goes down. Your survival depends on work, and much of the available work happens at night. The docks operate around the clock, with ships arriving and departing on the tide regardless of the hour. The markets need to be supplied before dawn, which means goods must be moved through the dark streets. The pubs and gin palaces do their busiest trade in the evening hours, requiring servers, cleaners, and security. If you're a woman, your options are even more limited and infinitely more dangerous. Domestic service might keep you safely indoors, but positions are scarce and the pay barely covers a bed in a lodging house. Factory work exists, but the hours are brutal and the conditions dangerous. You might survive Jack the Ripper only to die from industrial accidents or occupational diseases. Many women turn to street selling, hawking matches, flowers, or food from dawn to dusk. But even this requires being out in public where predators of all kinds can spot you. The most chilling aspect of your situation is how the killer seems to understand the rhythms of your world. He knows that certain streets empty out after the pubs close, that the police patrols follow predictable patterns, and that his potential victims are often intoxicated, desperate, or both. Historians still argue whether Jack the Ripper was a local resident or an outsider, but his intimate knowledge of the area's geography and social dynamics suggests someone who had spent considerable time observing the community. You begin to notice how the fog that rolls in from the Thames provides perfect cover for someone with malicious intent. The combination of coal smoke, industrial emissions, and natural moisture creates a thick, yellowish haze that reduces visibility to just a few feet. Gas lamps, spaced far apart and often broken or extinguished, create pools of weak light separated by vast stretches of impenetrable darkness. The killer doesn't need to be particularly stealthy. The environment itself provides camouflage. The architecture works against you as well. The tenement buildings create deep shadows and hidden alcoves where someone could wait unseen. The numerous courtyards and alleyways offer multiple escape routes, while the similar-looking streets make it easy for even residents to become disoriented, especially after dark or under the influence of alcohol. You realize that what seems like a familiar neighborhood during the day becomes an alien landscape at night. Your fellow residents are changing too, becoming suspicious and paranoid. The usual community bonds that help people survive in poverty, sharing information, looking out for each other's children, offering mutual aid, begin to fray under the pressure of fear. People start viewing their neighbors as potential threats, and the social networks that might normally provide protection begin to collapse. The economic pressure intensifies your vulnerability. You can't afford to be choosy about work, clients, or locations. If someone offers you a job that requires walking through a dangerous area at night, you take it because the alternative is starvation or homelessness. If a potential customer seems suspicious but has money, you serve them because you need every penny to survive another day. You also discover that the authorities' response to the growing danger actually makes your situation worse. The increased police presence focuses on controlling the local population rather than protecting it. Officers conduct aggressive searches and interrogations that disrupt the informal economy many residents depend on. The heightened scrutiny drives legitimate business away from the area, reducing employment opportunities and making everyone more desperate. The press attention begins to transform Whitechapel into a tourist attraction for thrill seekers from other parts of London, adding another layer of danger and exploitation to your daily existence. Well-dressed visitors arrive to gawk at the poverty and perhaps catch a glimpse of where the murders occurred, treating your neighborhood like a macabre entertainment venue while contributing nothing to the community's welfare or safety. Your first night shift begins like any other, except for the knot of anxiety that's taken up permanent residence in your stomach. The foreman at the match factory has offered you extra work, night cleaning that pays double the usual rate because nobody else wants to walk home through Whitechapel after midnight. You need the money desperately. Your rent is due tomorrow, and the landlord has already made it clear that eviction is just one missed payment away. You clock in as the sun disappears behind the grimy industrial skyline, and immediately you're struck by how different the world becomes after dark. The familiar sounds of daytime commerce, street vendors calling their wares, children playing in the courtyards, the general bustle of survival, fade into an ominous quiet broken only by distant shouts, the occasional crash of breaking glass, and the ever-present sound of your own footsteps echoing off wet cobblestones. The work itself is mind-numbing but necessary. You scrub floors with caustic soap that burns your hands, empty waste bins filled with the detritus of industrial production, and clean machinery that could easily maim or kill you if you're not careful. The phosphorus used in match production has already begun to affect your health. Your jaw aches constantly, and you've noticed your teeth are becoming loose, early signs of the phossy jaw that will eventually disfigure and possibly kill you if you keep this job long enough. But here's the cruel irony. This dangerous, health-destroying work is actually safer than what awaits you outside. Inside the factory, you're surrounded by other workers, protected by walls and locks, with supervisors who have a financial interest in keeping you alive and productive. The moment you step outside, you become prey in a hunting ground where the predator has already proven his skill and ruthlessness. Your shift ends at 2 a.m., the deadliest hour in Whitechapel. This is when the pubs have closed but the drunks haven't yet made it home, when the police patrols are at their thinnest, and when anyone still on the streets is either up to no good or desperately vulnerable. You join the small group of night workers making their way through the maze of streets, but even in numbers you don't feel safe. The fog has rolled in thick tonight, reducing visibility to just a few yards. The gas lamps create weak pools of yellowish light that seem to make the darkness beyond them even more impenetrable. You can hear footsteps that don't quite match the rhythm of your group, shadows that move independently of their supposed owners, and the occasional sound that might be a cat or might be something much worse. Historians still argue whether Jack the Ripper specifically targeted prostitutes or simply attacked vulnerable women who happened to be out at night, but from your perspective, the distinction is meaningless. You're a woman alone on the streets of Whitechapel after midnight, which makes you a potential victim regardless of your profession or intentions. The killer doesn't seem to conduct interviews before selecting his targets. Your route home takes you through Dorset Street, already gaining a reputation as the most dangerous thoroughfare in London. The lodging houses here are the cheapest and most desperate, filled with people who have nowhere else to go. The smell of unwashed bodies, cheap gin, and human waste creates a miasma that seems to cling to your clothes and hair. You pass doorways where figures huddle in the shadows, some sleeping, some conducting business you don't want to think about, and some simply watching with eyes that reflect the gaslight like a predator's. The sound of your own breathing becomes unnaturally loud in the thick air. Every footstep seems to echo with supernatural clarity, advertising your presence to anyone who might be listening. You find yourself walking faster, then forcing yourself to slow down because running would only attract more attention. The key is to look purposeful but not panicked, poor but not desperate, aware but not paranoid. A nearly impossible balance to maintain when genuine terror is clawing at your chest. You pass the site where Polly Nichols was found just weeks ago, though you don't know her name yet. She's just the first one in the growing catalog of horror that's transforming your neighborhood. The spot has been cleaned, but somehow it still feels different, marked by violence in a way that transcends physical evidence. Other pedestrians give the area a wide berth, crossing to the other side of the street or taking longer routes to avoid the cursed ground. The worst part is the uncertainty. Every shadow could hide a killer. Every footstep behind you could belong to someone with murderous intent, and every person you encounter could be either a fellow victim or the predator himself. The paranoia is exhausting, but it's also necessary for survival. In this environment, the difference between healthy caution and debilitating fear is measured in heartbeats and the distance to the nearest help. You finally reach your lodging house, a decrepit building that houses 40 people in conditions that would horrify modern observers but represent relative luxury in your current circumstances. The night clerk barely looks up as you pay for your bed. A narrow cot in a room shared with 7 other women, most of whom are already asleep or pretending to be. The morning of August 31st, 1888, changes everything. You're awakened not by the usual sounds of the lodging house coming to life, but by shouting in the street below and the heavy footsteps of police constables rushing past your window. The discovery of Polly Nichols' body in Bucks Row has sent shockwaves through a community already hardened by violence and death. Because this isn't just another murder. This is something different, something that speaks to a level of calculated brutality that makes your blood run cold. You join the crowd gathering near the crime scene, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that compels people to slow down at traffic accidents. The police have cordoned off the area, but not before dozens of residents have trampled through, contaminating evidence and spreading rumors that grow more horrific with each retelling. You catch glimpses of the chalk outline where her body was found, and even that sanitized representation of violence makes your stomach churn. The details emerge slowly, whispered from person to person like a deadly game of telephone. Polly Nichols, a 43-year-old woman who had been trying to earn money for a bed in a lodging house, was found with her throat cut so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. But that wasn't the worst of it. Her abdomen had been slashed open with what appeared to be surgical precision, suggesting someone with anatomical knowledge and a very sharp knife. What makes your skin crawl isn't just the brutality, but the calculated nature of the attack. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was methodical, almost ritualistic in its execution. The killer had taken time with his work, which means he felt confident he wouldn't be interrupted. In a neighborhood where people live practically on top of each other, where privacy is non-existent and someone is always watching, how did he manage to commit such an elaborate murder without being seen or heard? You realize that Polly Nichols could have been you. She was a working-class woman trying to survive in impossible circumstances, someone who had fallen on hard times and was doing whatever necessary to earn enough money for basic shelter. The night she died, she had been turned away from a lodging house because she was 4 pence short of the bed fee. A sum so small it wouldn't buy a cup of coffee in your time, but the difference between life and death in hers. The police response reveals just how little protection you can expect from the authorities. The investigation is hampered by jurisdictional disputes between the City of London Police and the Metropolitan Police, bureaucratic incompetence, and a fundamental lack of understanding about how to investigate this type of crime. The officers treat the murder as they would any other East End violence, a regrettable but not particularly surprising event in a neighborhood known for its rough character. Historians still argue whether the police took the Nichols murder seriously enough in those first crucial hours, but from your perspective as a potential victim, their casual attitude is terrifying. The constables seem more interested in maintaining order and preventing panic than in actually catching the killer. Their questions focus on the victim's character and lifestyle rather than on identifying potential suspects or establishing a timeline of events. The press coverage begins almost immediately, but it's sensationalized and often inaccurate. Newspapers compete to publish the most lurid details, often inventing facts when the real ones aren't dramatic enough. This creates a feedback loop where public fear feeds media attention, which in turn amplifies the terror and makes the killer's psychological impact even greater. You notice how the murder changes the social dynamics of your community. People who previously showed solidarity in the face of poverty and oppression now eye each other with suspicion. The usual gathering places, the pubs, the markets, the street corners where people exchange information and gossip, become tense and paranoid. Conversations stop when strangers approach, and everyone seems to be evaluating everyone else as a potential threat. The economic impact hits immediately. Businesses that depend on evening trade see their customers disappear as people become reluctant to venture out after dark. Street vendors who work the night markets find themselves with no customers and no income. The informal economy that keeps many residents alive begins to collapse under the weight of fear. Women, in particular, find their already limited options further restricted. Employers become reluctant to hire female workers for evening shifts, not out of concern for their safety, but because they don't want the liability or the disruption if something happens. This forces more women into increasingly desperate situations, making them even more vulnerable to both the killer and other predators who see opportunity in the chaos. You begin to understand that you're not just dealing with a single murderer, but with the complete breakdown of the social systems that provide even minimal protection for the vulnerable. The police are incompetent, the press is exploitative, the government is indifferent, and the community is fracturing under pressure. In this environment, survival becomes a matter of pure chance rather than skill or caution. The most chilling realization is that Polly Nichols' murder is just the beginning. The methodical nature of the killing, the apparent anatomical knowledge of the perpetrator, and the complete lack of witnesses suggest someone who has planned carefully and will likely strike again. You're living in a community that has become a hunting preserve for a predator who seems to understand your world better than the authorities trying to protect it. 8 days later, Annie Chapman's mutilated body is discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, and any hope that Polly Nichols' murder was an isolated incident evaporates like morning mist. You're walking to work when you hear the commotion, women screaming, men shouting for the police, and that particular quality of chaos that accompanies the discovery of something truly horrific. The crowd gathering around Hanbury Street has a different energy than the curious onlookers who came to gawk at the first crime scene. These people are genuinely terrified. The details that emerge make Polly Nichols' murder seem almost merciful by comparison. Annie Chapman, a 47-year-old woman who had been sleeping rough and trying to earn money for lodging, was found with her throat cut and her body opened from chest to pelvis. But this time, the killer had taken trophies, organs removed with what the police surgeon describes as considerable anatomical skill. The precision of the cuts suggests someone with medical training, or at least extensive experience with human anatomy. What makes your blood freeze isn't just the escalating brutality, but the timing and location of the attack. Annie Chapman was killed in broad daylight around 5:30 in the morning, in a backyard that was overlooked by multiple windows and accessible through a house where people were sleeping just feet away. The killer had grown bold enough to work in conditions where discovery seemed almost inevitable, yet somehow he had completed his grisly task and escaped without being seen. You realize that nowhere is safe anymore. The first murder could be explained away as a crime of opportunity in a dark, isolated location, but this second killing proves that the murderer is willing and able to strike anywhere, anytime. The backyard where Annie Chapman died is the kind of space you might use yourself. A a semi-private area where the desperate go to conduct business, sleep rough, or simply escape the chaos of the streets for a few moments. The police response reveals the complete inadequacy of Victorian law enforcement when faced with this type of crime. The scene is contaminated within minutes as curious neighbors trample through the backyard, destroying evidence and making it impossible to reconstruct the killer's movements. The investigation focuses on Annie Chapman's character and lifestyle rather than on identifying potential suspects or establishing security measures to prevent future attacks. Historians still argue whether the police could have done more with the resources and knowledge available to them in 1888, but from your perspective as a potential victim, their incompetence is literally a matter of life and death. The officers seem more concerned with maintaining public order than with actually catching the killer, and their questioning of witnesses focuses on moral judgments rather than useful information. The press coverage becomes even more sensationalized, with newspapers competing to publish the most graphic details of the murder. The coverage creates a feedback loop where public fascination feeds media attention, which in turn provides the killer with the notoriety he seems to crave. You begin to understand that you're not just dealing with a murderer, but with someone who is using the media to amplify his psychological impact on the community. The economic consequences of the second murder are immediate and devastating. The few businesses that had remained open in the evening after Polly Nichols' death now closed their doors at sunset. Street vendors abandon their pitches, domestic workers refuse night shifts, and even the most desperate residents think twice before venturing out after dark. The informal economy that keeps many people alive begins to collapse entirely. Your own situation becomes increasingly precarious. The match factory where you work nights announces that they're suspending evening operations indefinitely, citing concerns about worker safety and the difficulty of finding people willing to walk home through Whitechapel after dark. This eliminates your primary source of income and forces you to compete with hundreds of other displaced workers for the few daytime positions available. The social fabric of the community continues to deteriorate under the pressure of fear and suspicion. People who had previously looked out for each other now view their neighbors as potential threats. The usual gathering places become tense and paranoid, with conversations stopping when strangers approach and everyone evaluating everyone else as a possible killer. Women find themselves in an impossible situation. The authorities and the press suggest that the victims brought their fate upon themselves through their lifestyle choices. But the reality is that poverty leaves few options for survival. You can't afford to be choosy about work, clients, or locations, yet every choice you make could potentially put you in the path of a killer who seems to understand the rhythms and vulnerabilities of your world better than anyone trying to protect it. The most terrifying aspect of Annie Chapman's murder is what it reveals about the killer's psychology and methods. The escalating brutality suggests someone who is gaining confidence and satisfaction from his crimes. The anatomical precision indicates planning and preparation. The daylight timing shows a willingness to take enormous risks for the sake of his compulsions. All of these factors point to someone who will almost certainly kill again, and soon. You begin to realize that you're living through the early stages of a reign of terror that will transform your neighborhood into a hunting ground where the predator holds all the advantages and the prey, people like you, have nowhere to run and no one to turn to for protection. September 30th, 1888, becomes known as the night of the double event, and it shatters any remaining illusion that you might somehow avoid becoming a victim through caution, luck, or divine intervention. 2 women die within an hour of each other, in different locations, proving that Jack the Ripper has reached a level of confidence and bloodlust that makes every person in Whitechapel a potential target in what has become a systematic campaign of terror. You're working a rare evening shift at a local bakery, one of the few businesses still operating after dark, when the first wave of panic hits the streets. Elizabeth Stride has been found dead in Dutfield's yard, her throat cut but her body otherwise unmutilated. The killer was apparently interrupted before he could complete his usual ritual, which means he's still out there, still hungry for the satisfaction that was denied him, and likely looking for another victim to finish what he started. The police response to Stride's murder is swift but ultimately useless. Officers flood the area, questioning witnesses and searching for clues, but their heavy-handed approach only serves to drive potential witnesses underground and contaminate the crime scene. The investigation focuses on the political meeting that had been taking place nearby, with authorities more concerned about socialist agitators than about protecting the community from a serial killer. But the real horror is yet to come. While police are still processing the scene in Dutfield's yard, Catherine Eddowes is being butchered in Mitre Square, less than a mile away. The killer has found his second victim of the night, and this time he's able to complete his grisly work without interruption. Eddowes is found with her throat cut, her abdomen opened, and organs removed with the same surgical precision that characterized the previous murders. The timing of the double murder reveals the killer's intimate knowledge of police procedures and patrol patterns. He knows exactly how long he has before officers will arrive at a crime scene, how they'll deploy their resources, and where the gaps in their coverage will appear. This isn't random violence. It's a carefully orchestrated campaign by someone who has studied his hunting ground with the dedication of a military strategist. You realize that the killer's ability to strike twice in one night, in different locations, while evading the largest police manhunt in London's history, demonstrates a level of skill and preparation that makes him virtually unstoppable. He's not just lucky or opportunistic. He's methodical, intelligent, and completely ruthless in his pursuit of victims who fit his preferred profile. The psychological impact of the double event is devastating. If the killer can murder 2 women in one night while the entire Metropolitan Police Force is on high alert, then no one is safe, no precaution is sufficient, and no amount of vigilance can guarantee survival. The community's faith in the authorities' ability to provide protection collapses entirely, leaving residents to fend for themselves in an environment where the predator holds every advantage. Historians still argue whether the Stride murder was actually committed by Jack the Ripper or by a different killer, but from your perspective as a potential victim, the distinction is meaningless. Whether it's one killer or multiple killers, the streets of Whitechapel have become a hunting ground where violent death can strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. The press coverage of the double event reaches new heights of sensationalism, with newspapers publishing detailed descriptions of the crime scenes and speculating wildly about the killer's identity and motives. The coverage creates a media circus that attracts thrill seekers and amateur detectives from across London, adding another layer of chaos and danger to an already volatile situation. Your economic situation becomes desperate as the few remaining sources of income disappear. Businesses that had managed to stay open after the first 2 murders now close permanently, unable to find workers willing to risk their lives for wages that barely cover basic survival. The informal economy that had provided a safety net for the most vulnerable members of the community collapses entirely under the weight of fear and paranoia. The social dynamics of the neighborhood undergo a complete transformation. People who had previously shown solidarity in the face of poverty and oppression now view each other with suspicion and fear. The usual gathering places become ghost towns after dark, and even during the day, conversations are conducted in whispers and constantly interrupted by nervous glances toward the shadows. Women find themselves trapped in an impossible situation. The authorities suggest that staying indoors after dark will provide safety, but poverty doesn't allow for such luxuries. You need to work to survive, and much of the available work happens at night or requires traveling through dangerous areas. The choice becomes whether to risk starvation or risk becoming the killer's next victim. The most chilling aspect of the double event is what it reveals about the killer's escalating confidence and appetite for violence. The fact that he was willing to kill twice in one night, despite the massive police presence and public attention, suggests someone who is not only unafraid of being caught, but who may actually be enjoying the challenge of evading capture while terrorizing an entire community. You begin to understand that you're not just dealing with a serial killer, but with someone who has turned murder into a form of performance art, using the streets of Whitechapel as his stage and the residents as his unwilling audience in a show that can only end with more death and terror. The letters begin arriving at newspaper offices and police stations like a plague of paper, each one claiming to be from the killer himself. And suddenly you're living in a world where psychological warfare has been added to the very real threat of physical violence. The most famous of these, the Dear Boss letter received by the Central News Agency, introduces the name that will haunt history, Jack the Ripper. But for you, trapped in the epicenter of this media circus, the letters represent something far more terrifying than historical curiosity. They're proof that the killer is not only aware of his impact on the community, but actively working to amplify the terror. You first hear about the letters through the whispered conversations that spread through the lodging houses and markets like wildfire. Someone claims to have seen the actual text. Someone else insists they know a police officer who confirmed the details. And within hours, multiple versions of the letter's contents are circulating through Whitechapel, each more horrifying than the last. The killer's promise to clip the lattice ears off and send them to the police becomes a recurring nightmare that haunts your sleep and follows you through your daily routine. The psychological impact of the letters is immediate and devastating. It's one thing to know that a killer is stalking your neighborhood. It's another entirely to realize that he's literate, articulate, and actively taunting the authorities while promising more violence. The letters transform the murders from random acts of violence into a deliberate campaign of terror, with each resident of Whitechapel serving as both potential victim and unwilling participant in the killer's twisted game. But here's where your situation becomes even more precarious. The letters inspire hundreds of copycats and hoaxers who flood the authorities with fake correspondence. Historians still argue whether any of the letters attributed to Jack the Ripper were actually written by the killer, but the sheer volume of fake letters creates a smokescreen that makes it impossible for police to distinguish between genuine threats and elaborate pranks. You discover that some of your neighbors are writing their own Ripper letters as a form of dark entertainment or misguided attempt to help the investigation. The local pub becomes a gathering place for amateur detectives who spend their evenings crafting increasingly elaborate theories about the killer's identity and motives. What they don't realize is that their amateur sleuthing and fake letters are actively hindering the investigation and making it more difficult for authorities to identify genuine leads. The media coverage of the letters creates a feedback loop that amplifies the terror beyond anything the actual murders could have achieved alone. Newspapers compete to publish the most sensational excerpts, often embellishing or completely fabricating details to increase sales. The coverage transforms Jack the Ripper from a local threat into a national obsession, bringing unwanted attention to Whitechapel and turning your neighborhood into a tourist attraction for thrill seekers and sensation hunters. The economic impact of the letter campaign is devastating. The media attention drives away what little legitimate business remained in the area, while attracting exactly the kind of visitors you don't want. Journalists looking for lurid stories, amateur detectives hoping to solve the case, and morbid tourists seeking a glimpse of the locations where the murders occurred. These visitors contribute nothing to the local economy while treating the residents like exhibits in a freak show. Your daily life becomes increasingly surreal as the line between reality and media sensationalism blurs beyond recognition. You can't tell which rumors are based on actual police information and which are the product of newspaper imagination or local gossip. The constant stream of conflicting information creates a state of perpetual anxiety where every shadow could hide a killer and every stranger could be either a victim or a perpetrator. The letters also create a dangerous precedent by giving the killer or killers a direct channel to communicate with the public. Each new letter that arrives, whether genuine or fake, reignites public hysteria and provides the perpetrator with exactly the kind of attention and notoriety that may be motivating the crimes in the first place. You're living in a community that has become unwitting participants in a sick form of interactive entertainment. The police response to the letters reveals yet another layer of institutional incompetence. Instead of treating the correspondence as potential evidence or intelligence, authorities allow journalists to publish the letters almost immediately, destroying any chance of using them to trace the sender or verify their authenticity. The decision to release the "Dear Boss" letter to the press transforms what could have been a valuable investigative tool into a media sensation that spawns hundreds of imitators. You notice how the letters change the behavior of everyone around you. People become amateur handwriting analysts, comparing notes and theorizing about the killer's background based on his penmanship and vocabulary. Neighbors who can barely read suddenly become experts on linguistic analysis, debating whether the letter's Cockney slang is genuine or affected, whether the red ink is actually blood, and what the killer's grammar reveals about his social class. The most insidious effect of the letter campaign is how it transforms the murders from acts of violence against specific individuals into an abstract puzzle for the public to solve. The focus shifts from protecting potential victims to analyzing clues, from providing security to debating theories. Annie Chapman and Polly Nichols become characters in a mystery story rather than real women who died horrible deaths. And you begin to understand that you too could become nothing more than a plot point in someone else's entertainment. The fake letters create their own category of danger. Some are obvious pranks written by attention seekers or drunks, but others are detailed enough to suggest that their authors have genuine knowledge of the crimes or even criminal intent of their own. The police can't ignore any of them, which means resources that should be devoted to catching the real killer are instead wasted chasing false leads and investigating harmless cranks. You realize that the letter campaign has created a perfect storm of confusion and misdirection that serves the killer's purposes beautifully. While police waste time analyzing handwriting samples and chasing fake leads, while journalists compete to publish the most sensational theories, and while the public becomes obsessed with solving the mystery, the real killer is free to continue his work without interference. The psychological warfare aspect of the letters is perhaps their most effective element. By communicating directly with the public, the killer creates the impression that he's everywhere and nowhere, that he's watching everyone and could strike at any moment. The letters transform him from a single individual into an omnipresent threat that permeates every aspect of daily life in Whitechapel. As the letter campaign continues and intensifies, you begin to understand that you're not just dealing with a serial killer, but with someone who has weaponized the media and turned public fascination with violence into a force multiplier for terror. The letters ensure that even when he's not actively killing, Jack the Ripper remains a constant presence in your life, a source of fear and anxiety that poisons every moment of your existence in his chosen hunting ground. The harsh reality of your situation crystallizes with devastating clarity. You're not just living in fear of a serial killer, you're living as a member of the exact demographic that Victorian society considers expendable. Your social class, your gender, and your occupation have combined to paint a target on your back that's visible to both the killer and a society that views your potential death as regrettable but hardly surprising. The intersection of poverty, gender, and social status in 1888 London creates a perfect storm of vulnerability that makes you ideal prey for someone who understands how to exploit the system's indifference to your survival. Your poverty isn't just about lacking money. It's about lacking any form of social protection or political voice. In Victorian England's rigid class system, you occupy the bottom rung of a hierarchy that views your very existence as evidence of moral failing. The prevailing social philosophy holds that poverty is a choice, that the deserving poor can lift themselves up through hard work and moral behavior, and that anyone who remains in destitution must be fundamentally flawed in character. This worldview transforms your economic desperation from a systemic problem into a personal failing, making it easier for both authorities and the general public to dismiss your safety as less important than that of your social betters. The geographical reality of your situation compounds your vulnerability. Whitechapel isn't just poor. It's deliberately isolated from the rest of London, both physically and socially. The East End serves as a dumping ground for everything respectable society wants to forget: the unemployed, the mentally ill, the elderly, and the foreign. You're living in what amounts to a human reservation, a place where the normal rules of civilization are suspended and violence is accepted as an inevitable part of daily life. Your gender adds another layer of danger that would be difficult for modern people to comprehend. As a woman in Victorian England, you have virtually no legal rights, no economic independence, and no political representation. You can't vote, can't own property if you're married, and have limited access to education or professional opportunities. Your value to society is measured entirely by your relationship to men, as daughters, wives, or mothers, and if you fall outside those categories, you become virtually invisible to the protective structures that might otherwise shield you from harm. The occupational hazards of your situation extend far beyond the immediate physical dangers of whatever work you can find. If you're employed in domestic service, you're isolated in private homes where abuse can occur without witnesses. If you work in factories, you're exposed to dangerous machinery and toxic chemicals with no safety regulations to protect you. If you're forced into street work of any kind, selling goods, cleaning, or other services, you're constantly exposed to the elements, to criminal predators, and to police harassment. The most insidious aspect of your social position is how it shapes the response to the murders themselves. The authorities and press consistently frame the victims as somehow responsible for their own deaths, suggesting that their lifestyle choices or moral failings made them natural targets. This victim blaming serves a dual purpose. It allows society to feel safe by believing that respectable people are immune to such violence, and it reduces pressure on authorities to actually solve the crimes or protect potential victims. You discover that the police view you and your neighbors not as citizens to be protected, but as a criminal class to be controlled. The increased patrols following the murders focus more on harassing local residents than on identifying potential suspects from outside the community. Officers routinely search people without cause, interrogate witnesses with obvious hostility, and treat requests for protection as nuisances rather than legitimate concerns. The press coverage reveals society's deep-seated prejudices about class and gender. Newspapers describe the victims in terms that emphasize their social status and supposed moral failings rather than their humanity. The coverage creates a narrative where the murders are tragic but understandable consequences of the victims' choices, rather than horrific crimes against innocent people who happen to be vulnerable. Your economic desperation makes it impossible to take the precautions that might protect you. You can't afford to be selective about work, clients, or locations. You can't refuse night shifts or dangerous assignments. You can't move to a safer neighborhood or higher protection. Every choice you make is constrained by the immediate need to survive, and the killer seems to understand these constraints perfectly. The social isolation of your class means that disappearances often go unnoticed for days or weeks. You don't have family members with social connections who will pressure authorities to investigate. You don't have employers who will report you missing if you fail to show up for work. You don't have neighbors who will immediately notice if you don't come home. Because privacy is a luxury none of you can afford, and everyone minds their own business as a matter of survival. The intersection of class, gender, and occupation creates a perfect victim profile that the killer exploits with surgical precision. He targets women who are economically desperate, socially isolated, and geographically concentrated in an area where violence is normalized and police protection is minimal. He understands that society's indifference to your welfare gives him a hunting ground where he can operate with relative impunity. You begin to realize that Jack the Ripper isn't just a serial killer. He's a symptom of a social system that has already marked you for death through poverty, discrimination, and neglect. The knife may deliver the final blow, but Victorian society has spent years making you vulnerable to exactly this kind of predation. In a world where your life has no value to those in power, becoming a victim isn't just possible. It's almost inevitable. The police response to Jack the Ripper's reign of terror reveals a level of institutional incompetence so profound that it actively endangers your life and the lives of everyone around you. What you're witnessing isn't just a failure to catch a killer. It's a systematic breakdown of law enforcement that transforms the authorities from protectors into obstacles, making the streets of Whitechapel more dangerous than they would be with no police presence at all. The jurisdictional nightmare begins with the simple geographical reality that the murders occur across multiple police districts. The Metropolitan Police control most of London, but the City of London Police maintain their own separate force with their own procedures, priorities, and pride. When Catherine Eddowes is murdered in Mitre Square, which falls under city jurisdiction, the investigation immediately becomes a turf war between competing agencies more concerned with protecting their authority than with catching the killer. You witness this bureaucratic chaos firsthand when police from different forces arrive at crime scenes and spend more time arguing about who has jurisdiction than they do examining evidence. Crucial hours are lost while officers debate procedural matters, contaminate crime scenes through their disputes, and fail to coordinate their efforts in any meaningful way. The killer benefits enormously from this confusion, using the boundaries between police districts as escape routes and safe havens. The investigative methods employed by both forces reveal a shocking lack of understanding about how to solve this type of crime. Officers approach each murder as an isolated incident rather than part of a pattern, failing to coordinate information or develop a comprehensive understanding of the killer's methods. Evidence is collected haphazardly, witness statements are taken carelessly, and potential leads are pursued with no systematic approach. You watch in horror as police contaminate crime scenes through their own incompetence. Officers allow crowds of curious onlookers to trample through areas where crucial evidence might be found. They fail to secure perimeters, permit journalists to photograph and disturb crime scenes, and frequently move or remove evidence before proper examination can take place. The scene of Annie Chapman's murder becomes a public spectacle within hours, with dozens of people walking through the backyard and destroying any chance of reconstructing the killer's movements. The interrogation methods used by police are both brutal and ineffective. Officers routinely arrest local residents on the flimsiest pretexts, subjecting them to aggressive questioning that focuses more on extracting confessions than on gathering useful information. The authorities seem to operate on the assumption that someone in the neighborhood must know something about the murders, and they're willing to terrorize innocent people to find out what that might be. Your own encounters with police investigating the murders reveal their fundamental prejudices about the community they're supposed to protect. Officers treat you and your neighbors as potential suspects rather than potential victims, approaching every interaction with suspicion and hostility. When you report suspicious activity or offer information that might be helpful, you're met with skepticism and accusations rather than gratitude and follow-up investigation. The police response to the letters claiming to be from Jack the Ripper demonstrates a complete lack of strategic thinking. Instead of treating the correspondence as potential evidence or intelligence, authorities immediately release the letters to the press, destroying any chance of using them to trace the sender or verify their authenticity. This decision transforms what could have been valuable investigative tools into media sensations that spawn hundreds of imitators and red herrings. The manhunt efforts reveal the authorities' poor understanding of the neighborhood and its residents. Police conduct random searches and raids that disrupt the community without producing any useful results. They arrest obvious scapegoats, foreign residents, mentally ill individuals, anyone who seems suspicious by their prejudiced standards, while ignoring more promising leads that don't fit their preconceptions about what a killer should look like. The communication between different levels of law enforcement is virtually non-existent. Beat constables who patrol the streets and might have valuable insights about local patterns and suspicious activity are never consulted by the detectives investigating the murders. Information flows poorly between shifts, between departments, and between the competing police forces, creating a situation where the same ground is covered repeatedly while other areas remain completely uninvestigated. The political pressure on police to solve the case quickly leads to a series of increasingly desperate and counterproductive measures. Officers make arrests based on insufficient evidence, pursue theories that have been thoroughly debunked, and waste resources on elaborate schemes that any competent investigator would recognize as hopeless. The need to appear active and engaged takes precedence over actually conducting effective investigation. You realize that the police response to the Ripper murders has actually made your situation more dangerous in several ways. The heavy-handed tactics used in the investigation have driven potential witnesses underground, making residents less likely to report suspicious activity or cooperate with authorities. The focus on arresting local residents as suspects has created an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that isolates people from each other and from potential sources of help. The authorities' failure to provide any meaningful protection for potential victims forces you to rely on your own resources and judgment for survival. But their incompetent investigation techniques have also made it impossible for you to assess the real level of danger you face. You don't know whether the killer is a local resident or an outsider, whether he's targeting specific types of victims or attacking randomly, or whether he's operating alone or with accomplices. The most damaging aspect of police incompetence is how it emboldens the killer and potentially other criminals who see that law enforcement is incapable of maintaining order. Jack the Ripper's ability to commit increasingly brazen murders while evading capture sends a message that the authorities cannot protect anyone, encouraging other predators to take advantage of the breakdown in social order. You begin to understand that the police response to the Ripper murders represents more than just investigative failure. It's a complete abdication of the social contract that's supposed to provide security in exchange for civic compliance. In a world where the authorities are not only unable to protect you, but actively make your situation more dangerous through their incompetence, survival becomes entirely a matter of luck, instinct, and the killer's whims. The surgical precision of Jack the Ripper's mutilations creates a terrifying new dimension to your already precarious existence. Any knowledge of human anatomy, however basic, transforms you from a potential victim into a potential suspect. The police and press have seized upon the idea that the killer possesses medical training, and suddenly your rudimentary first aid skills, your experience working in a slaughterhouse, or even your familiarity with butchering animals for food makes you a person of interest in the most notorious murder investigation in London's history. You discover this horrifying reality when police begin conducting sweeps of the neighborhood, questioning anyone who might have anatomical knowledge. Your brief stint helping the local midwife deliver babies, your work preparing meat at the market, or your experience tending to injured workers at the match factory suddenly becomes evidence of potential guilt rather than honest labor. The authorities operate on the assumption that anyone capable of making the precise cuts found on the victims must have formal training, ignoring the reality that basic anatomy knowledge is widespread among the working class. The medical establishment's analysis of the murders creates a profile that casts suspicion on a broad swath of the community. Doctors examining the bodies report that the killer removed organs with considerable skill and speed, suggesting someone familiar with human anatomy. But their assessment fails to account for how many people in Whitechapel have acquired such knowledge through necessity rather than formal education. Your neighbors begin viewing you with suspicion if you've ever demonstrated any medical knowledge, however rudimentary. The woman who helped deliver your landlady's baby last year suddenly avoids eye contact when you pass in the hallway. The man who worked in the slaughterhouses before they closed down finds himself shunned at the local pub. Anyone who has ever expressed interest in medical matters or shown competence in treating injuries becomes a potential Jack the Ripper in the fevered imagination of a terrified community. The reality of working-class life in Victorian London means that most people have some exposure to anatomy and medical procedures out of sheer necessity. You've learned to stitch wounds because you can't afford a doctor. You know how to set bones because industrial accidents are common and medical care is scarce. You understand basic anatomy because you've had to butcher animals for food or work in industries that require knowledge of how bodies function. The police interrogation techniques reveal their fundamental misunderstanding of how anatomical knowledge is acquired and used. Officers assume that anyone capable of making surgical cuts must have attended medical school or worked as a physician, ignoring the reality that slaughterhouse workers, butchers, and even experienced cooks develop similar skills through daily practice. They're looking for someone with formal credentials when the killer might simply be someone who has learned through experience. Your association with anyone in the medical profession becomes a liability. If you've ever worked as a cleaner in a hospital, assisted a local doctor, or even carried medical supplies, you find yourself under scrutiny. The authorities cast their net so broadly that anyone who has ever been in proximity to medical knowledge becomes a potential suspect, regardless of their actual competence or opportunity to commit the crimes. The press coverage amplifies the paranoia by publishing detailed descriptions of the killer's supposed medical skills, creating a public obsession with identifying anyone who might possess such knowledge. Newspapers speculate wildly about the killer's background, suggesting he might be a doctor, a medical student, a veterinarian, or anyone else with access to anatomical training. This speculation turns every interaction with medical professionals into a potential encounter with a serial killer. You realize that the focus on medical knowledge serves a dual purpose for the authorities. It allows them to narrow their investigation to a specific type of suspect, and it shifts attention away from their own incompetence by suggesting that the killer is a criminal mastermind rather than someone who has exploited obvious weaknesses in law enforcement. The medical angle provides a convenient explanation for why the murders haven't been solved, deflecting blame from police failures. The class implications of the medical knowledge theory reveal the authorities' prejudices about who could be capable of such crimes. Police seem more interested in investigating middle-class suspects with formal medical training than in considering working-class individuals who might have acquired similar skills through experience. This bias leads them to overlook potential suspects while harassing innocent people whose only crime is possessing knowledge that could help their communities survive. Your own medical knowledge, however limited, becomes a source of constant anxiety. You begin to hide your skills, refusing to help injured neighbors or demonstrate any familiarity with anatomy. The knowledge that once made you valuable to your community now makes you a target for suspicion, forcing you to choose between helping others and protecting yourself from false accusations. The investigation's focus on medical knowledge creates a chilling effect on the community's ability to provide mutual aid. People become reluctant to seek help for injuries or illnesses, afraid that anyone who demonstrates medical competence might be the killer. This paranoia weakens the informal support networks that help residents survive in poverty, making everyone more vulnerable to both the killer and the ordinary hazards of life in the East End. You begin to understand that the medical knowledge theory represents more than just an investigative strategy. It's a reflection of society's need to believe that such horrific crimes could only be committed by someone with specialized training and education. The alternative, that the killer might be an ordinary person who has learned through experience, is too terrifying for authorities and the public to contemplate. The most insidious aspect of the medical knowledge obsession is how it transforms useful skills into evidence of guilt. Your ability to help others, to treat injuries, or to understand how bodies work becomes not a valuable community resource, but a potential marker of criminal intent. In a world where survival often depends on mutual aid and shared knowledge, the Ripper investigation has made competence itself a form of evidence against you. As the investigation continues and the focus on medical knowledge intensifies, you realize that your anatomical skills, learned through necessity, poverty, and the desire to help your community, have made you a suspect in crimes you had no part in committing. The very knowledge that makes you valuable to your neighbors now makes you dangerous to yourself, creating another layer of vulnerability in an already impossible situation. November 9, 1888. brings a horror so profound that it redefines your understanding of human evil and your own vulnerability. Mary Jane Kelly's murder in her tiny room at 13 Miller's Court represents the apex of Jack the Ripper's brutality, a crime so savage that it haunts even the hardened police officers who discover her remains. For you, living just streets away from where Kelly died, the murder serves as a terrifying preview of what awaits if you ever find yourself alone and defenseless in the killer's presence. The news reaches you through the same whispered networks that have carried information about the previous murders. But this time the voices are different, shakier, more horrified, struggling to find words for what has been discovered. Mary Kelly wasn't just killed. She was systematically destroyed in a frenzy of violence that lasted hours and left her body so mutilated that she could only be identified by her hair color and the remains of her clothing. What makes Kelly's murder uniquely terrifying is that it occurred indoors, in a space where she should have been safe from the killer who had previously struck on the streets. Her small room in Miller's Court, barely large enough for a bed and a table, becomes a private chamber of horrors where the killer had unlimited time to indulge his escalating bloodlust without fear of interruption. The privacy of the location allowed him to commit atrocities that would have been impossible in the public spaces where his previous victims died. You learn the details reluctantly, through fragments of conversation and newspaper accounts that struggle to describe the indescribable. Kelly's face had been rendered unrecognizable, her body opened and organs removed with the same surgical precision that characterized the earlier murders, but with a level of methodical destruction that suggests hours of uninterrupted work. The killer had taken his time, experimenting with different forms of mutilation, as if Kelly's body were a canvas for his twisted artistry. The psychological impact of Kelly's murder is devastating because it shatters the few remaining illusions about potential safety that had helped you cope with the previous attacks. The earlier victims had been killed quickly on the streets, but Kelly's murder proves that the killer is capable of sustained, methodical torture that transforms death from a moment of terror into an extended nightmare. The privacy of her room had protected her from street predators only to deliver her to something far worse. Your own living situation becomes a source of constant anxiety as you realize that the thin walls and flimsy locks that provide the illusion of privacy could easily become the walls of your own execution chamber. The lodging house where you rent a bed offers no real security. The locks are simple, the windows are easily accessible, and the other residents are too concerned with their own survival to notice if someone goes missing for hours or days. The timeline of Kelly's murder reveals the killer's complete confidence in his ability to operate without detection. Evidence suggests she was killed sometime between 2 and 4 a.m., during the hours when the neighborhood is at its quietest but when people are still moving about, returning from work, visiting the pubs, or conducting the business that keeps the informal economy alive. The killer spent hours with Kelly's body while the community slept just feet away, separated only by thin walls and locked doors. The police response to Kelly's murder demonstrates their continued incompetence in the face of escalating violence. The crime scene is contaminated within hours as officers, officials, and even photographers trample through the tiny room, destroying evidence and making it impossible to reconstruct the killer's movements. The investigation focuses on Kelly's personal life and relationships rather than on the broader pattern of violence that she represents. You realize that Kelly's murder marks a turning point in the killer's psychology and methods. The previous attacks had been opportunistic, taking advantage of victims who were vulnerable on the streets, but Kelly's murder was planned and deliberate. The killer had to know about her living situation, her habits, and her schedule to successfully trap her in her room for the extended period required to commit such elaborate mutilation. The press coverage of Kelly's murder reaches new heights of sensationalism, with newspapers competing to publish the most graphic details while simultaneously expressing shock and horror at the killer's brutality. The coverage creates a feedback loop where public fascination with the violence encourages more detailed reporting, which in turn may be providing the killer with the recognition and notoriety he seeks. Your neighbors' reactions to Kelly's murder reveal the complete breakdown of community solidarity under the pressure of sustained terror. People who had previously looked out for each other now view everyone with suspicion and fear. The usual gathering places become ghost towns as residents retreat into isolation, trusting no one and venturing out only when absolutely necessary for survival. The economic impact of Kelly's murder is immediate and devastating. The few businesses that had managed to remain open after the previous attacks now closed permanently, unable to find customers willing to venture out or workers willing to risk their lives for wages. The informal economy that had provided a safety net for the most vulnerable members of the community collapses entirely under the weight of terror. You begin to understand that Kelly's murder represents more than just the peak of the killer's violence. It's a demonstration of his complete mastery over the environment he has chosen as his hunting ground. He has proven that he can strike anywhere, anytime, and that no amount of precaution or preparation can guarantee safety. The privacy that Kelly sought in her small room became the very thing that enabled her destruction. The most chilling aspect of Kelly's murder is what it reveals about the killer's escalating appetite for violence and his growing confidence in his ability to evade capture. The systematic nature of the mutilation suggests someone who is not only unafraid of being caught, but who may actually be enjoying the process of destroying his victims. The extended timeline of the attack proves that he feels completely safe operating in the heart of the community he has terrorized. As news of Kelly's murder spreads through Whitechapel, you realize that you are no longer just living in fear of becoming a victim. You are living with the knowledge that if the killer chooses you, your death will not be quick or merciful. The horror of Kelly's fate becomes a constant presence in your mind, a reminder that in this world of predators and prey, being selected by Jack the Ripper means enduring unimaginable suffering before finding the release of death. The collective terror that grips Whitechapel after Mary Kelly's murder transforms your neighbors from allies in survival into a dangerous mob driven by paranoia, desperation, and the primal need to strike back at something, anything, that might be responsible for the nightmare consuming your community. What emerges isn't justice but a form of collective madness that makes the streets as dangerous for innocent residents as they are for potential victims of the Ripper himself. You first witness this vigilante mentality when a crowd gathers around a man who has the misfortune of being foreign, well-dressed, and carrying a leather bag through Whitechapel after dark. Within minutes, whispers of, "That's him," and "He's got the look," escalate into shouts and physical confrontation. The man's explanations that he's a traveling salesman fall on deaf ears as the crowd's bloodlust overrides any interest in facts or evidence. Only the timely arrival of police prevents what could have been a lynching. The mob psychology that takes hold of your community operates on a simple and terrifying logic. Someone among you is the killer, and the only way to stop the murders is to identify and eliminate the threat. This reasoning transforms every interaction with your neighbors into a potential accusation, every unusual behavior into evidence of guilt, and every attempt to avoid suspicion into proof of culpability. Your own position becomes increasingly precarious as the vigilante fever spreads. The same neighbors who once offered mutual aid and protection now scrutinize your every move for signs of suspicious behavior. If you stay out late for work, you're questioned about your whereabouts. If you keep to yourself, you're suspected of hiding something. If you try to help calm tensions, you're accused of diverting attention from the real killer. The criteria for suspicion reveal the deep-seated prejudices and fears that have always existed in your community but now have a deadly outlet. Foreign residents, particularly Jewish immigrants, face the worst of the mob violence, attacked not for any evidence of guilt but simply because they're different and therefore convenient scapegoats. Men with medical knowledge, unusual occupations, or solitary habits find themselves targets of collective suspicion that can turn violent with little provocation. You realize that the vigilante mentality serves multiple psychological functions for a traumatized community. It provides the illusion of action when the authorities have proven incompetent, offers a sense of control when residents feel completely powerless, and creates an outlet for the rage and fear that have been building for months. The problem is that these psychological needs are being met through violence against innocent people rather than effective measures to catch the real killer. The formation of citizen patrols and vigilante groups initially seems like a positive development, neighbors organizing to protect each other and patrol the streets. But you quickly discover that these groups are more interested in hunting suspects than in providing security. The patrols become roving bands of amateur detectives who harass residents, break into homes, and conduct their own interrogations with methods that would make the police blush. Your daily routine becomes a constant navigation of potential accusations and mob violence. You learn to avoid certain streets where vigilante groups congregate, to never be alone in public spaces where you might be confronted by suspicious neighbors, and to always have explanations ready for your movements and activities. The energy you once devoted to avoiding Jack the Ripper now must be split between the original threat and the new danger posed by your own community. The most disturbing aspect of the vigilante phenomenon is how it feeds on itself, creating a cycle of violence and suspicion that makes everyone less safe. Each false accusation and mob attack makes residents more paranoid and more likely to turn on their neighbors. The social bonds that had helped the community survive poverty and hardship dissolve under the pressure of mutual suspicion and the fear of being the next target of vigilante justice. You witness several incidents where innocent people are seriously injured or nearly killed by mobs convinced they've found the Ripper. A mentally ill man who talks to himself becomes a target because his behavior seems strange. A night shift worker who can't account for his whereabouts during one of the murders is beaten unconscious before police can intervene. A local butcher finds his shop vandalized and his family threatened because someone decides his professional skills make him suspicious. The authorities' response to the vigilante violence reveals their priorities and limitations. Police are more concerned with preventing mob violence than with addressing the underlying fear and frustration that drives it. They arrest vigilantes when they can catch them, but they make no effort to provide the community with the security and effective investigation that might reduce the desperation that fuels the mob mentality. The press coverage of vigilante incidents creates another layer of danger by sensationalizing the violence and often implying that the mobs might be onto something. Newspapers publish accounts of near lynchings with barely concealed approval, suggesting that desperate times call for desperate measures and that the community's violent response is understandable given the authorities' failures. You begin to understand that the vigilante phenomenon represents a complete breakdown of social order that makes Jack the Ripper's work easier rather than harder. The climate of suspicion and violence drives potential witnesses underground, makes residents reluctant to report suspicious activity, and creates so much chaos that the real killer can operate with even less fear of detection. The economic impact of vigilante violence compounds the damage already done by the murders themselves. Businesses that had managed to survive the initial terror now close permanently as owners fear being targeted by mobs convinced that anyone with resources or unusual habits must be the killer. The informal economy that had provided a safety net for the most vulnerable members of the community collapses entirely under the weight of mutual suspicion. Your own moral compass becomes increasingly difficult to navigate as you watch neighbors you've known for years turn into violent vigilantes. The same people who had shared food during hard times and looked after each other's children now participate in mob attacks against innocent residents. The community solidarity that had been one of the few bright spots in your harsh existence transforms into its opposite, a collective madness that makes everyone both victim and perpetrator. The most chilling realization is that the vigilante violence might actually be serving the killer's purposes by creating additional terror and chaos that makes his own crimes seem like just another part of the general breakdown of civilization in Whitechapel. In a world where your neighbors are as likely to attack you as protect you, where innocence provides no protection against mob violence, and where the search for justice has become another form of predation, survival becomes not just a matter of avoiding Jack the Ripper, but of navigating a community that has lost its collective sanity. The newspaper coverage of Jack the Ripper's crimes transforms your neighborhood from a place of poverty and hardship into a macabre tourist attraction and a breeding ground for copycat violence that makes the streets more dangerous than the original killer ever could have achieved alone. The press doesn't just report on the terror. It amplifies, distorts, and commodifies it, turning your suffering into entertainment and your fear into profit while creating new forms of danger that threaten everyone in Whitechapel. You first notice the media invasion when well-dressed journalists and photographers begin appearing on your streets, treating the murder scenes like tourist attractions and the residents like exhibits in a freak show. These reporters don't live in your world. They arrive in carriages, take notes about the squalor and moral degradation they observe, and then return to comfortable homes in safer neighborhoods to write sensationalized accounts that bear little resemblance to the reality you experience daily. The newspaper coverage creates a feedback loop of violence and sensationalism that makes your situation exponentially more dangerous. Each lurid headline and graphic description of the murders inspires not just public fascination but also copycat crimes by individuals who see an opportunity to either capitalize on the fear or fulfill their own violent fantasies, while using Jack the Ripper as cover for their actions. You witness this copycat phenomenon firsthand when a series of attacks occur that don't match the Ripper's pattern but are clearly inspired by the media coverage. Women are assaulted by men who whisper threats about doing what Jack does. Businesses are vandalized by people claiming to be the killer, and hoax letters flood newspaper offices from individuals seeking attention or attempting to spread additional terror through false claims of responsibility. The most insidious aspect of the press coverage is how it transforms real violence into entertainment for readers who are safely removed from the danger. Newspapers compete to publish the most graphic details, the most sensational theories, and the most horrifying speculation about what the killer might do next. Your neighbors' deaths become plot points in a serial story designed to sell papers rather than human tragedies deserving of dignity and justice. The press coverage also creates a distorted understanding of the murders that makes it harder for residents to protect themselves. Newspapers focus on the most dramatic aspects of the crimes while ignoring practical information that might help potential victims stay safe. The coverage emphasizes the killer's supposed medical knowledge and surgical skill while downplaying the opportunistic nature of his victim selection and the environmental factors that make his crimes possible. Your own encounters with journalists reveal their complete indifference to the impact their coverage has on the community they're exploiting. When reporters interview you about living in Whitechapel during the murders, they're not interested in your perspective as a potential victim or your insights about community safety. They want colorful quotes that will make their articles more dramatic and their readers more horrified. The economic exploitation becomes obvious as newspapers use the Ripper murders to boost circulation and advertising revenue. Special editions featuring the latest developments command premium prices, while regular coverage brings in readers who might not otherwise be interested in news about the East End. Your community's suffering becomes a commodity to be packaged and sold to consumers hungry for thrills they can experience safely from their parlors. The press coverage creates a dangerous myth about the killer's abilities and intelligence that makes him seem more threatening than he actually is. Newspapers portray Jack the Ripper as a criminal mastermind who can strike anywhere and evade any security measure, when the reality is that he's successful primarily because he's operating in an environment with minimal police protection and abundant vulnerable targets. You realize that the media attention has transformed Whitechapel into a destination for thrill seekers and amateur detectives who come to gawk at the murder sites and hunt for clues. These visitors create additional chaos and danger, interfering with police investigations, harassing residents, and sometimes committing crimes of their own while using the general atmosphere of lawlessness as cover. The press coverage also fuels the vigilante violence by publishing inflammatory articles that suggest the killer might be a foreign resident, a local doctor, or someone with specific characteristics that match innocent members of your community. These articles provide pseudoscientific justification for mob attacks and create an atmosphere where suspicion and violence against marginalized groups is not just tolerated but encouraged. The most damaging aspect of the sensationalized coverage is how it shifts attention away from the systemic factors that make the murders possible: poverty, inadequate policing, social inequality, and the general indifference of authorities to the welfare of East End residents. Instead of examining these root causes, newspapers focus on the killer's personality and motives, treating the murders as the work of a supernatural monster rather than the predictable result of social conditions. You begin to understand that the press coverage serves the interests of everyone except the people who are actually at risk. It provides entertainment for readers, profits for publishers, and convenient distraction for authorities who would rather discuss the killer's psychological profile than address their own failures to protect vulnerable citizens. The only people who don't benefit from the sensationalized coverage are the residents of Whitechapel, who must live with the consequences of increased danger and social chaos. The international attention generated by the press coverage brings additional problems as foreign journalists and sensation seekers arrive to experience the terror firsthand. These visitors often have romantic notions about the murders that lead them to take dangerous risks, creating additional work for police and sometimes becoming victims themselves when they underestimate the very real dangers of the East End. The letters claiming to be from Jack the Ripper become a media phenomenon that generates more coverage and copycats, creating a cycle where each fake letter inspires more fake letters and more sensationalized reporting. The press publishes these letters with minimal verification, turning what should be evidence in a criminal investigation into public entertainment that inspires hundreds of imitators. Your daily life becomes increasingly surreal as you navigate not just the original threat of Jack the Ripper, but also the secondary dangers created by media coverage. Copycat criminals, vigilante mobs inspired by newspaper theories, thrill-seeking visitors who treat your neighborhood like a theme park, and the general atmosphere of chaos and suspicion that makes everyone more vulnerable to all forms of predation. The most horrifying realization is that the press coverage has transformed Jack the Ripper from a local danger into a global phenomenon whose influence extends far beyond his actual crimes. The sensationalized reporting has created a template for how serial killers can use media attention to amplify their psychological impact, turning a series of murders in one neighborhood into a form of mass terrorism that affects people who will never set foot in Whitechapel. The sudden cessation of murders after Mary Kelly's death in November 1888 creates a form of psychological torture that may be worse than the terror of the active killing spree. You wake each morning wondering if this will be the day the violence resumes. Live each night wondering if the killer is still out there watching and waiting, and navigate each interaction wondering if you're speaking to the man who butchered your neighbors. The silence isn't peace. It's the oppressive quiet before a storm that might never come, or might arrive when you least expect it. The weeks following Kelly's murder pass without new canonical victims, but the absence of bodies doesn't bring relief. It brings a different kind of torment. You find yourself analyzing every shadow, every footstep, every stranger's glance, wondering if Jack the Ripper is still among you, perhaps planning his next move, or if he has simply moved on to terrorize some other unfortunate community. The not knowing becomes its own form of violence, a psychological assault that continues long after the physical attacks have stopped. Your neighbors react to the silence with a mixture of cautious hope and paranoid vigilance that makes normal social interaction nearly impossible. Some people convince themselves that the killer has died, been arrested, or fled London, allowing them to venture out after dark with something approaching their former confidence. Others become more suspicious and fearful, interpreting the silence as evidence that the Ripper is still present but has simply become more careful about selecting his victims and timing his attacks. The press coverage of the silence creates additional uncertainty and fear by speculating endlessly about the killer's whereabouts and intentions. Newspapers publish theories about whether Jack the Ripper has been imprisoned for other crimes, committed suicide, or simply moved to another city where his murders haven't yet been connected to the Whitechapel killings. Each theory is presented with the same sensationalistic certainty that characterized the coverage of the actual murders, making it impossible for you to distinguish between informed speculation and pure fiction. You realize that the killer's silence might be more psychologically devastating than his active campaign of murder. During the height of the terror, you at least knew what you were facing: a deadly predator who struck in predictable patterns at vulnerable victims. Now you're dealing with the unknown, with possibilities that range from complete safety to imminent danger, and your mind creates scenarios that are often worse than the reality you actually experienced. The police response to the silence reveals their continued incompetence and the limitations of their investigation. Officers seem as confused and uncertain as everyone else, offering no reliable information about whether the killer has been caught, died, or simply stopped killing. The lack of official communication leaves residents to rely on rumors, speculation, and their own fearful imaginations to make sense of the situation. Your daily routine becomes a constant exercise in risk assessment and psychological management. You must decide whether to resume normal activities or continue living in a state of heightened vigilance, whether to trust that the danger has passed or assume that it's simply hidden. The mental exhaustion of maintaining constant alertness for months begins to take its toll, but relaxing your guard feels like an invitation to disaster. The economic impact of the silence is complex and contradictory. Some businesses begin to reopen as customers cautiously return to the streets, but others remain closed because owners can't be certain that the danger has actually passed. The informal economy that had collapsed during the height of the terror shows signs of recovery, but the underlying anxiety and uncertainty prevent any real return to normal commercial activity. The silence also creates opportunities for other predators who understand that residents are still fearful and vulnerable. Criminals who have nothing to do with Jack the Ripper begin to exploit the atmosphere of terror, using the community's continued fear to facilitate robberies, assaults, and other crimes. The Ripper's psychological legacy becomes a tool for common criminals who understand that terrified people are easier to victimize. You begin to notice how the silence affects different people in different ways. Some residents become convinced that they can identify the killer among their neighbors, pointing to anyone whose behavior seems unusual or who fits the various profiles suggested by press coverage and amateur detectives. Others become paranoid about everyone, unable to trust friends and neighbors they've known for years because the killer might be anyone, anywhere. The most disturbing aspect of the silence is how it forces you to confront the possibility that Jack the Ripper might still be living among you, perhaps as a seemingly normal member of the community. The person who serves you at the market, who lives in your building, who works alongside you, could be the same individual who tortured and killed Mary Kelly. This possibility transforms every social interaction into a potential encounter with evil, making genuine human connection nearly impossible. The international attention that had focused on Whitechapel during the murders begins to fade as the silence continues. But this withdrawal of interest doesn't improve your situation. The departure of journalists and sensation seekers removes some of the chaos and exploitation you had experienced, but it also means that the world stops caring about your community's ongoing suffering and vulnerability. You realize that the silence has created a form of limbo where you can neither fully recover from the trauma of the murders nor prepare for new dangers because you don't know what you're facing. The psychological wounds left by months of terror cannot heal while the possibility of renewed violence remains. But the absence of immediate danger makes it difficult to maintain the vigilance that might be necessary for survival. The most chilling realization is that the killer's silence might be deliberate, a conscious choice to maximize the psychological impact of his crimes by leaving the community in a state of perpetual uncertainty. If Jack the Ripper is still alive and free, he may understand that the fear of his return is almost as effective as actual murder in maintaining his control over the community he has terrorized. As the weeks turn to months without new canonical murders, you find yourself trapped in a psychological prison where the bars are made of uncertainty, paranoia, and the terrible knowledge that the worst crime spree in London's history ended not with justice or resolution but with silence. A silence that might be temporary, might be permanent, and might be the most cruel and effective form of torture the killer could have devised. The absence of answers becomes its own form of violence, a continuing assault on your peace of mind and sense of security that proves Jack the Ripper's influence extends far beyond his actual crimes. In the terrifying quiet that follows the storm, you realize that sometimes the waiting is worse than the attack, and that a predator's greatest power might lie not in what he does, but in what he might do next. As you stand in the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel, surrounded by the accumulated weight of everything that has made survival impossible, you finally understand the terrible truth that has been building throughout this nightmare. You were never going to escape Jack the Ripper's reign of terror, not because you lacked intelligence, courage, or resourcefulness, but because every single aspect of your existence in Victorian London has been deliberately designed to make you perfect prey for a predator who understands the system better than those who created it. Your poverty wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a death sentence that forced you into the killer's hunting ground and kept you there even as the danger became obvious. Your gender wasn't just a source of discrimination. It was a target painted on your back in a society that viewed women as expendable and their deaths as inevitable consequences of moral failing. Your social class wasn't just a barrier to opportunity. It was a guarantee that your disappearance would go unnoticed and your death would be blamed on your own choices rather than systemic failure. The perfect storm of conditions that created Jack the Ripper's hunting ground didn't happen by accident. Victorian society had spent decades creating the exact environment where such predation could flourish, concentrating the vulnerable in isolated neighborhoods, providing minimal police protection, maintaining social attitudes that dehumanized the poor, and creating economic conditions that forced people into desperate situations where they became easy targets. You realize now that every choice you've made, every precaution you've taken, every strategy you've employed for survival has been constrained by forces beyond your control. You couldn't afford to be selective about work, clients, or locations. You couldn't avoid dangerous neighborhoods or refuse night shifts. You couldn't trust the police for protection or the authorities for justice. You couldn't even trust your own neighbors, who had been transformed by fear and desperation into potential threats. The killer's success wasn't due to supernatural cunning or exceptional skill. It was due to his understanding of how Victorian society had already marked certain people for death through neglect, discrimination, and indifference. Jack the Ripper didn't create the conditions that made his crimes possible. He simply exploited conditions that had been created by a social system that valued some lives more than others. Your fate was sealed not by the killer's blade, but by the social blade that had been cutting away at your options, your safety, and your humanity long before the first murder occurred. The poverty that kept you in Whitechapel, the gender that made you a target, the social class that made you invisible to those in power, these were the real weapons that killed you, with Jack the Ripper serving merely as the final instrument of execution that had been ordered by society itself. The most horrifying realization is that your death would have been forgotten as quickly as those of the canonical victims. Despite the sensational press coverage and public fascination with the murders, the names of Jack the Ripper's victims are largely unknown to history, while the killer's identity remains a source of endless speculation and entertainment. Your suffering would have been commodified, your story would have been distorted, and your death would have been reduced to a footnote in someone else's mystery. The authorities who failed to protect you would have explained your death as the inevitable result of your lifestyle choices. The press that sensationalized your community's suffering would have used your murder to sell papers while expressing mock outrage at the killer's brutality. The social reformers who claimed to care about the poor would have cited your case as evidence of the need for moral improvement rather than systemic change. Everyone would have found a way to make your death about something other than their own failure to protect you. You understand now that surviving Jack the Ripper was never really about avoiding a single killer. It was about surviving an entire social system that had already marked you for death. The fog that concealed the killer's movements was the same fog that concealed society's indifference to your welfare. The darkness that hid his crimes was the same darkness that hid the systemic violence that made his individual violence possible. Your inevitable fate awaits not because you're unlucky or unprepared, but because you're living in a world that has already decided you're expendable. The perfect storm of poverty, gender discrimination, social inequality, police incompetence, media exploitation, and community breakdown hasn't left you any real options for survival. Every path leads to the same destination: a brief, brutal encounter with evil in a dark alley, followed by a shallow grave and a quickly forgotten name. The most tragic aspect of your fate is that it's not really about Jack the Ripper at all. He's just the final actor in a drama that was written by Victorian society, directed by social inequality, and performed on a stage built from the bones of the poor. Your death will be attributed to him, but it will really be the result of every person who looked the other way while social conditions deteriorated, every official who treated your community as a problem to be contained rather than citizens to be protected, and every reader who consumed sensationalized accounts of your suffering as entertainment. As the fog closes in around you and the footsteps behind you match your own rhythm with predatory precision, you realize that you're not just another victim of Jack the Ripper. You're another victim of a social system that created him, enabled him, and will ultimately profit from your death. The killer's blade will end your life, but society's blade had already ended your hope, your options, and your chance of survival long before you ever heard the name that will be whispered in the darkness as your world fades to black. In the end, you wouldn't have survived Jack the Ripper's reign of terror because you were never meant to survive it. You were born into a world that had already decided your fate, lived in a society that had already marked you for death, and died in a system that had already moved on to its next victim before your blood had dried on the cobblestones. Your story ends not with justice or resolution, but with the terrible understanding that in Victorian London's perfect storm of social conditions, becoming another forgotten victim wasn't just possible, it was inevitable.